This was a great year for culture. We had 2 goals that we actually had every year, but this was the first year we accomplished either of them. Our first goal was to get the journal out on time so that before half the student body had left for summer break. And we did it. It's waiting for you in the Braun room with the food. Our second goal is to sort of expand our role on campus and to host events that demystify the processes of writing and publishing. And that's happening right now, right here at this panel. So big year for the journal. It's our 3rd year. I won't take too much time before introducing the panelists, but I should just recognize all the people that make culture possible. We're funded by Center for the Study of World Religions. Susan Lohenberger is here. Office of Communications, Will Joyner there as our advisor. He's indispensable. Life Together, which I'm sure there's some people here, and Department of Sanskrit and Indian Studies, strangely enough. So thank you to them. Also, are there any peer reviewers here today? Rebecca? Peer reviewers help the editors. We send them the papers, and they do a lot of work editing and critiquing the papers before we make our final decisions. And I think a lot of the most interesting intellectual work that happens at Culture are these anonymous conversations. And the peer reviewers do really top-notch reviewing for someone else's glory, which I think is a really wonderful thing to do. So they're recognized in the inside of the journal, and they deserve it. Let's see. Finally, our authors, some of whom have class today and some of whom have playoff tickets to the Celtics, which is a totally reasonable excuse, I think. But let's see. Rebecca Berger is here. Kelly Jo Fulkerson is here. Who else? Stella Dubish is here. And Jeremy, all of whom were authors this year in our biggest pool of essays. So congratulations. The essays in the journal are also really good this year. So please don't just pick up the journal, read it. The topics are scintillating, at least to me. Rapidly, they discuss the reclamation of the word missionary for post-colonial Hindus in America. Max wrote on the political presence of Protestants in the popular press, which I have to assume was for last year's Religious Topics Starting with P seminar. Female suicide bombers through an Arendtian lens, fascinating. Enduring Contributions of Zoroastrianism was written by Matt Paulson, who's not here tonight. Eunuchs in the Bible by Jeremy, and Rebecca wrote on why ministry for the masses requires alone time, which is so true, and she writes about it well. So that's all I have to say. I'll introduce our panelists. Who's going first? Professor David Hempton. In the fall, the editors got together and wrote down our dream list of professors who would speak at our first annual event, and they all said yes. So we're really happy to have you, and I can't wait to hear you speak. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a great honor to be here at this celebratory event. It looks great, really, doesn't it? It's great color and some great articles. The announcement I have to make is that the student who has the tickets to the Celtics game is Max Muller. And we worked pretty hard on him today to get him to announce those tickets, but we failed in class. It was an 8 o'clock class, and I don't think he was awake at the time. Anyway, it is an honor to be here. I sort of feel I'm here under false pretenses, really, because most of my experience of writing and publishing has been rather boring and sadly very conventional. So if nothing else, perhaps I can stand as a visual aid of what to avoid in your careers as writers. I have a 3-point talk, and I'll keep this pretty brief. The first point is the boring bit. It's called that, actually, the boring bit, which is the conventional route into academic publishing. The second point is the mildly less boring bit, some dilemmas of publishing. And then the third point is the almost interesting bit, finding one's voice. So first of all, the boring bit. I was a pretty, very conventional sort of student that I followed the advice I was given when I finished my PhD. And I was one of those kind of British IELTS PhD students who sort of finishes at a tender age of 24, no coursework, no comprehensive exams and so on. You just straight in, thesis out. The advice I was given, really, the conventional advice then, was to publish as quickly as one could in reasonably well-established journals, and then to try and get a first book out with a reputable university press. And that's what I set myself to do. I did learn a couple of painful lessons during that phase of my career, however. The first one was just how hard it is to get one's first pieces of work accepted for publication. My PhD thesis was trolled around 10 publishing houses. And I had 10 rejection letters, which I still have. But it was a kind of blessing in disguise, I think, really, because it wasn't ready to be published, and it forced me to pause for a bit and to revise it, which I think ultimately saved my career. And my first journal article, was submitted to the Journal of Ecclesiastical History, and it was turned down with a very kind of snotty note from the editor, who was then Eamon Duffy, Stripping of the Altars, Eamon Duffy book, and he wrote and said, no, we don't really like it. And my supervisor, when he got the letter, was so outraged that he wrote to Eamon Duffy saying that this article is much better than he thinks it is, and that he should reread it. And Eamon Duffy, to his credit, reread it, and they accepted it for the journal. So that's where my first article appeared, the Journal of Ecclesiastical History, back in 1978, almost 30 years ago. So that's one thing, how difficult it is to get one's work published. And then I think in my case, and maybe for some of you, the importance of a few lucky breaks, which can dramatically transform how your work is received. When my first book came out, the first review of it in the Times Higher Education Supplement, which is a big periodical in London, and I'll never forget this moment, wandering across University Square, clutching this newspaper and looking at my review, which was a savage review of the book. I still can never quite forget the feeling of pain that came with this, my first review, which I thought was going to be the... including, a number of comments. The person who reviewed it accused me erroneously of being a Marxist historian, really because I just took social context seriously. Those were the days when that was a term of abuse. But lo and behold, the book won a book prize. It was the Royal Historical Society's book prize for first books. And almost immediately after that, the wind got more favourable. Reviews were more favourable. Negotiations with publishers for future books became easier. So that kind of lucky break that comes one's way really had a terrific impact on my early publishing career. So all this is to say, I think one needs a bit of a thick skin in these early days, and also some sort of inner self-belief that what you're doing is valuable, so that when a few hard knocks come, you don't give up or feel too badly, though I must say I did feel pretty badly. After that, it was reasonably plain sailing, I think. From that point on, it was a matter of setting one's standards, which I think is very important early on. What are the standards you want to try and achieve? Choosing topics, and kind of rooting oneself in a kind of area of one's discipline, but willing to expand. And the combination of rootedness and expansion, I think, is very important. Neither one fully nor the other. And I think establishing a rhythm of productivity early in one's career is very important. There's all kinds of surveys of academic life in Britain and the United States that the publishing pattern you establish in the first 5 years of your career is likely to go with you throughout. And I certainly found that as when I was chairing a department for many years and trying to get people to publish things for the research assessment exercise in Britain. And it's very difficult to change people's productivity cycle, and to try and get a rhythm that works for you. When I set a target of trying to write a book once every 5 or 6 years or so, and a couple of articles a year, which was about 40 or 50,000 words a year, of trying to keep a pace like that going. Some people do much better than that. Some people, but whatever is comfortable, I think it's very difficult to force it beyond what is comfortable with you. And then there is a kind of there's a kind of mid-career switch happens to beware of. The first 10 years of your life you spend trying to persuade publishers to take you're kind of hawking it around like a kind of beggar. And then after that, the temptation to sign contracts, which then one does, because I'm very glad to have them. And then the stress that comes from deadlines. So beware of that switch. There's a seesaw point in one's career. And you exchange ignominy for hospital wards. Neither is particularly good. So that's the boring bit. In my case, it was a pretty conventional way in, I think. The mildly less boring bit, some dilemmas of publishing. I became chair of a history department in what was a very divided country and a very divided university, Queen's University Belfast, back in the era of the Troubles. And I had some expertise in the field of religion and political culture. I'd actually written a book about it. So how far was it legitimate to publish interpretive work on the state of the country when one was in a position of chairing a department where we were trying to establish a degree, a safe zone and a place of political neutrality and religious openness? And, of course, it's very difficult to offer interpretive pieces in a very divided society. It's not read one way by one tradition or another way. And merely simply driving down the middle isn't a very happy solution either. So I did find that quite hard. And I did produce one article on this problem, religion, politics in contemporary Ireland, which, looking back, is both interesting and sometimes embarrassing. How much one steps out of the academic ivory tower in difficult situations to speak into a situation where careless words can be dangerous. And I think that was something I never fully resolved. And looking back, I think I wish I'd done a little bit more of it, actually. I think I was too nervous and a little bit too conservative in that. But these are hard judgment calls. And linked to that, what kind of public profile was appropriate? How critical should one be of the faith traditions one seeks to influence, for example? Northern Ireland was a tough place to be if you had any enthusiasm for evangelical Protestantism, where Ian Paisley was the main spokesperson. And I've always found that quite difficult to navigate. Does one want to be listened to by the faith tradition, and therefore, to what extent does that influence in any way how you write or conceive of your work and so on? These are, I think, quite difficult areas. And then finally, the almost interesting bit, finding one's voice. I think one thing that we scholars struggle with quite a lot is, at least in my area, and I'm sure it's true in others as well, is how you produce technically demanding pieces of scholarship, but hope for a wider audience. Only a few of the very elite, I think, fully bring this off. I've not been numbered among them. How to think about that? And of course, as one gets a little bit older, one likes to try and communicate with a wider range of people. But that's a tricky one to navigate. Paying attention to one's writing style, I think, is very important. How can it be improved? I think good reading makes an enormous difference. And I once taught a course of 30 Victorian novels, which really did have a good effect on my writing style, I think. Good copy editing, paying attention to what talented copy editors write about your style and so on. And hard labour. It's a very difficult business. Looking back over one's writing career, one's style does change. And I have a 21-year-old son who thinks he can't write very well, and the truth of the matter is he can't write very well. But at 21, I knew I couldn't write very well, and I remember just pushing a few of my old essays to him and so on as a little bit of encouragement. But how you move on from that, I think, is a very kind of interesting and difficult thing that's worth thinking about. And then finally, does one have a hidden writing voice struggling to get out? Is the life of the scholar antithetical to other kinds of writing? Devotional, humorous, polemical, provocative, homiletic, or whatever? I have a kind of secret inner Walter Mitty desire to be a humorous writer, which I periodically indulge in letters to friends and so on. And I sort of half think I might possibly have a talent for it, but I don't quite know if I do. And it's getting a little bit late in the day to find out. But it's something I hope to resolve. So maybe someday a humorous blockbuster will reach your shelves.
I think we all know the answer to whether David Hempton is a humorous writer or not. Well, thank you. I am honored to be on anybody's dream team with Michael Jackson and David Hempton. I have not published nearly as much as either of them. So I will wax homiletic, which is what I do when I am not quite up to par here. First of all, congratulations to all the writers and editors who have worked on culture over this 3 years and made it into something so beautiful. I love the journal. I have loved it every year because it's great to see, essays from Intro to Ministry Studies alongside essays from some other class. That I'm not, a history class with David Hempton. Or there's often their sermons in culture. I love the commitment to putting lots of different kinds of writing together, and I really don't know of any other journal that does it in quite the way you all do. So congratulations to everyone. I want to sort of focus on the academic, religious, popular title that Allison and Kip gave us when they invited us to come and talk. And I was thinking back to two talks I've heard in my life that I think kind of exemplified for me what were, very high academic standards and beautiful academic writing, but also popular in the sense that they were understandable by people who are not specialists in the field. And these are talks I've heard David Hempton and Michael Jackson give. One is when Michael was considering maybe coming here to teach with us. He came and spoke with us about his work in anthropology. And there were just some phrases in his writing that were so beautiful to me that they're still in me, even though I couldn't reproduce his argument now if I had to. I'm sorry to say, but I do remember him talking about the pearl of a person. And he was reporting on field research that he was doing, and the incredible compassion and humanity of not just his argument, but of his writing was really striking to me. And then David Hempton's inaugural lecture, which I hope everyone heard, for the MacDonald Chair, his way of seeing around, as he sometimes puts it when we are upstairs in Rabinowitz's room grilling job candidates on their writing, seeing around all the way around the disenchanted evangelicals that he writes about. These were talks that were academic, and they were also, to me, popular. And I would say that they were religious, actually, in the loving attention, in the way two words set side by side can open a space in the world for new thought. But I don't know if my colleagues would agree with me, and I don't want to impose that on their writing if that's not what they're thinking. But to me, that kind of devotion to getting the right word, to finding the right word, is itself a religious practice. These talks spoke to more than specialists. I am not a specialist in anthropology or the history of 19th century evangelicals, but there wasn't a word in either of those talks that I didn't understand. Neither of them produced a closed world, which one needed the key of a particular jargon to enter. They did not, lay out a language game that only specialists could play. But it wasn't just the lack of jargon, and I want to say here that academic jargon is often a convenient straw person in conversations like this, and I'm not really against it. Sometimes it's got its own kind of beauty, and it's really useful and helps you say what you want to say and be understood by your colleagues. But that's only, I think, in very specific contexts, and here I'm talking about communication across boundaries, across disciplines, across communities, where I think it's not so useful. But it wasn't just a lack of jargon that I think made these talks so memorable to me, and so it was like food and water almost, hearing their language. What makes you keep reading when you pick up something to read that a professor has not assigned to you, or B, that you're not, looking for specific information, just something that you pick up to read because you want to lie in the tub and read something, or read something before you get before. What's the thing that keeps us reading? I think for me, it's voice, and of course Professor Hempton has already spoken of this. When I read Michael Jackson's work, At Home in the World, which is my favorite of his books, which he has in his lap here, or David Hempton's work, and I'm thinking here of his landmark book on Methodism, or the great lectures on disenchantment I've heard him give, I hear their voices. They're both beautiful writers, but there would be no confusing their voices. Their writing is academic, to be sure, in that it is born of careful and attentive research, and it moves our knowledge about what it means to be human forward. But I also consider their writing to be popular, and not in the sense that it's simplified in any way, because what's great about their work is that it's so attentive to the messiness and complexity of life and humanity, and it resists answers that go down too easily. But it's popular in the sense that it communicates across boundaries and across communities. They have, in the phrase of William Carlos Williams, democratic voices, voices that can be heard by a range of people, language that can be taken up and used. My voice as a writer, I think, has been shaped in part, by preaching, both by hearing a lot of preaching growing up, and also by having to learn to preach myself. There's nothing like hearing your own words spoken aloud from a pulpit to let you know how you're doing with your writing. A big part of the work of writing, of course, is revising, and a lot of revising is listening for the false notes. And preaching, it lets you hear your false notes with utter clarity. Terrifying clarity. The first job interview I ever had was for a job in medieval religion at a big state university, and after I gave my talk, which was actually on writing, it was on writing and mystical experience and some 13th century writers, the chair of the department took me out for breakfast to, talk about the salary and stuff like that. And he said, I'm curious about one thing. He said, do you think that your lecturing style has been influenced by your preaching? And I thought, wow, yeah, I guess it has. I was just out of graduate school, and I hadn't actually been preaching very long either. I really came into my vocation as a minister in the middle of my PhD and had to kind of figure things out from there. But I realized that preaching had influenced my writing, at least my writing style and my lecturing style, if not in the content, then in the way I tried to put words together, in the way I tried to communicate. Originally, the influence went very much the other way. When I first became a preacher, my sermons were these sort of historical lectures with a little high-minded scolding at the end, so we would all know we were in church. But eventually, I think the influence did start to go the other way. When I was thinking about writing my dissertation, which was the first big project I ever wrote, the first sustained long thing I ever wrote, and I realized that one of the things that, and I don't think I've had this thought before until I was thinking about this panel this afternoon, but one of the things that I think propelled me along, and that still propels me along through any writing project, is that I would put in lines and sentences here and there that just pleased me. And when I think of my dissertation, even now, I kind of think of a handful of sentences that I really loved, and that I felt were kind of hidden there among all that information, keeping the whole thing alive. And even now, I think it's the pleasure of particular sentences, not necessarily my own. Sometimes when I can't get going on something, I figure out a way to use one of my favorite sentences in literature, which is from a book by the poet Susan Howe and Emily Dickinson. This is it. It goes, one unchosen American woman alone at home and choosing. Anytime I'm stuck, I just try to stick that in somewhere, and that gets me going. I think for some people, and maybe for you, it's the scaffolding of the argument that keeps them going. And sometimes it's the narrative they're creating. I think perhaps for our colleagues here tonight, they're great tellers of stories. And so that can be something that propels us along. For me, it's the sentences. I think writing's so hard and it's so frequently unbearable that I think we have to relish our pleasures when they come. In our Journeys and Quest class, some of you are in that class, we've been reading Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, and there's this great scene where this painter, Lily Briscoe, is sitting at dinner, and she and the other women at the table are kind of having to bring the men along, as they start drowning in these conversations. They have to throw out the lifeline and reel them in and ask them about their dissertations and ask them about their research. And she glances at the salt shaker out of the corner of her eye, and as she glances at it, she thinks to herself about this painting that she's working on, and she thinks, oh, you know what I'll do? I'll move that thing a little bit more to the center. And she's flooded with pleasure and joy. And so for the rest of the night, every time she looks at that salt shaker, she thinks, oh, my painting. I'll move it a little bit to the, I'll rearrange things a little bit. And so I hope in your writing you have like some things like that tucked away, hidden away in your paragraphs, that when you think of them, flood you with joy. Whoever you understand yourself to be writing for, whether it's your congregation or your dissertation committee or the readership of the New York Times, all of your choices, this word instead of that word, this form, this voice, this tone, all of these choices matter so much. They matter both for the quality of your thought and for the invitation that you're able to give to your readers. The intellectual and aesthetic choices we make when we write are also moral choices, and they're also spiritual choices that can make room for others to think their thoughts and find their words, or that can really not, or can close them out. We shape or try to shape our writing, of course, but our writing also shapes us, forming us in generosity or humility or condescension or disdain. So all of those choices matter so much, and I think these years in school are such an irreplaceable opportunity. I wish I could have mine back. An irreplaceable opportunity to grow intimate with language and to test the weight and heft of words with all the writing that you're asked to do. It's a chance to find your voice. And not just by writing the first-person essays that Dudley and I encourage in Intro to Ministry Studies, but also by trying on other voices and taking on the demands of a range of disciplines that you feel very involved in and close to, and disciplines that you don't. Maybe you're taking a class with Michael Jackson and he's asking you to write like an anthropologist, or maybe you're taking a class with David Hempton and he's asking you to write like an historian. What a gift, to be invited into somebody else's discipline and to be asked to speak your own word from within it. It's a chance to hone the craft of academic writing. It's an opportunity to develop your capacity also to write popularly in the best sense, not in the dumbing down of your ideas or oversimplification, but in the sense of speaking in a voice that lots of different kinds of listeners can receive and be encouraged by, and that can open a space for people to do something with what you've done, which is why I think we write. It's an opportunity to develop your voice. I'll close by saying that we must all go to Italy as soon as we can and go to the Uffizi and go to the Botticelli room, where there's a tiny little painting in a corner. Don't get distracted by Venus and all of that, but he had a tiny little painting of Augustine writing in his cell. And it's hanging in a sort of a corner, and in the painting, Augustine's at his desk, and there's a big velvet curtain that's been pulled back so you can see him writing there. And he's writing away, who knows, the Confessions, one of his many biblical commentaries. But on the floor are all these wadded up pieces of paper and broken quills. And when you read him, and I hope you've read him in your years in divinity school, you do get the sense of somebody trying over and over again to get it even a little bit right, to keep starting over and to tell a story this way and then to tell it another way. And I can imagine how many broken quills and balled up pieces of paper went into this. And I thank you, all you writers and editors and peer reviewers, for the really hard work you did and the beautiful work you did. And I will read it cover to cover. Thanks so much.
Say after David and Stephanie said so much that is just so pertinent, because I feel deeply that unless one realizes that the business of thinking and the business of writing are one and the same, one is always going to be deficient in one's intellectual skills, and of course not pleasing many readers when they open up your book or look at your essay. Well, I'm going to talk a little about this book that Stephanie referred to, At Home in the World, which was first published in 1975, and is an account of my research in Central Australia among the Warlpiri people, and the preoccupation of that time was the question as to what is home, or what is being at home, particularly for a people that are nomadic and marginalised in the modern Australian state, in effect deprived of any kind of secure place. Now, there's two aspects of my research and writing that bear on the questions of genre, audience, and the political and ethical constraints that bear upon us when we're doing research and doing writing, particularly I think for ethnographers. And I'm going to kind of build my 10-minute talk around these questions. When my wife and I first went to Central Australia to do field work, we made contact with an organization called the Central Land Council, which coordinated research on Aboriginal people in Central Australia by actually obliging any would-be researcher to work for them for nothing and do work that they assigned, so that anything that you might want to do for yourself, like exploring the question of home, was something you had to kind of do after you had done the Land Council's commission. Moreover, in the contract that I agreed to sign with the Central Land Council to do research that they simply gave me to do, there was no kind of negotiation possible, the contract involved their right to veto anything in anything that I might publish that they considered to be inimical to Aboriginal interests. And this was a big risk, because who knows who might read my manuscript and what reasons might they find for rejecting the manuscript or rejecting the publication. It could be a personal interest, as it turned out to be, masquerading as a kind of a kind of veto that was in the best interests of Aboriginal people. But there was a quid pro quo here, which I think was very important at that time, and still is for anthropologists working in Australia with Aboriginal people, that you do your research, but on condition that you give something back, that you provide some service to Aboriginal people. Now, in the course of doing my research, I came to the resolution that I would not just publish a book for the academic community. I would try to kind of write a book that reached beyond the academic community and spoke to a general educated audience. And I just want to read you a couple of pages from the book which touch upon this moment. And these pages are really about the time when my wife and I left the field and drove back 900 miles without stopping from the community that we had been living with in the northern Tanami Desert to the town in Central Australia that you will all know the name of, Alice Springs. We arrived in late afternoon when the shadows were like graphite on the red earth. On the horizon, the western McDonnell Range lay like a collapsed column of eroded vertebra in the light of the setting sun. Soon we passed the first of many road signs. Stewart Tourist Park, home away from home. It made me wonder where indeed was home. Driving through the outskirts of Alice and seeing suburban streets for the first time in many months, I imagined families sitting around tables, eating dinner, watching TV, the place where they live with others of their kind, the place they call home, in the words of, I've forgotten the name of the American writer, short story writer. It'll come to me. This was the world I had wanted to get away from. Now it felt good to be coming back to it. We rented a cabin at the Winter Sun Caravan Park where we had stayed at the beginning of the year. The familiar surroundings brought back memories of how daunting our journey had seemed when we first embarked upon it. Now I saw that our anxieties had been trivial and chimerical. I felt purged. I felt I had reached bedrock. But for several days I felt awkward and out of place in the environment to which I had returned. I could not get used to sleeping in a bed, so each night I unrolled my swag and slept on the floor. It felt strange to sit perched on chairs around a table. On our first day back, I walked into town for lunch but could not face the prospect of eating indoors. So I bought a salad sandwich at a lunch bar and sat on the grass near the municipal offices in sight of groups of Aboriginals also sitting there. Afterward, I strolled through the main street. Australian folk music was coming from loudspeakers mounted on lampposts. Click go the shears, and the why of colonial boy in grating, nasalized accents. I wandered past a tourist shop. An old Arranta man with swollen face and bandaged hand was tottering about among the racks of T-shirts, talking loudly to himself about olden times, my culture. White shoppers pretended to be oblivious to him. It is astonishing how whites stare past blacks as though they did not really exist. Tourists want dreamtime artifacts, but no contact with the people who made them. Culture has become synonymous with coffee table books, red beads, and decorated boards, a far cry from the ongoing practical activity of the lived world. Living with Warlpiri people had restored to me a sense of proportion. Many of the trappings of contemporary life, TV, newspapers, running water, furniture, books, had become superfluous, mere home comforts. But the bloke I met that afternoon had another story to tell. I was sitting on the concrete steps outside our cabin, eating a slice of rock melon, when Barry Horn invited himself over for a yarn. "G'day, mate," he said. "How's it going?" He was wearing jandals, thongs, and black athletic shorts. Love was tattooed on the backs of the fingers of one hand, hate on the fingers of the other. "You new to the Alice?" he asked. "Sort of," I said. He suggested we sink a couple of tinnies. He had a couple of cold ones back in the cabin. He came back and sat on his haunches. He rubbed his hand over his bare chest. "Barry," he said, stretching out his hand. We shook hands. "Michael," I said. "Well, Mike," he said, raising his styrofoam beer bottle holder, "here's to it." He came from Perth. He described himself as fed up, fucked, and far from home. He was a plumber by trade. He'd been in the Territory for 8 months, installing ablution blocks and water pipes in remote Aboriginal communities. He described these places as the pits. "Fucking flies everywhere. And rubbish, mate. I've never seen so much fucking rubbish in my life." What got under Barry's skin was the way people managed to destroy the expensive plumbing within days of its installation. Kids dismembering the cisterns, flushing stones down the lavatories. Barry kept shifting his pack of Marlboros around on the concrete. His hand kept straying back to his chest and belly. He insisted he wasn't prejudiced against the Aboriginals he'd met in the bush. They weren't like the river rats who sat in the Todd and blew their dole checks on grog. But what can you do? You give them a decent house and they wreck it. They don't respect anything you do for them. Maybe they'd prefer you did other things for them. Things they decided they wanted, I suggested. Barry didn't seem to hear. He had a girlfriend, he said, called Ellie. "She's dark," he confessed. Apparently Ellie had cancer. She had only about 10 months to live. Barry and Ellie liked to go partying. Perhaps me and my wife would like to go out on the town with them one night. "Ellie's living it up," Barry said. "She's making the most out of the time she's got left." I did not know what to say to Barry. It was the same impasse I seemed to reach every day. I would get into a conversation with someone in a shop or downtown office. It would fall out that I had worked for an Aboriginal organization, and I would be immediately ear-bashed with stereotypes about Aboriginals no different from those in circulation 100 years ago. I would be told in no uncertain terms that Aboriginals were the most primitive people in the world, living remnants of the Stone Age, their culture unchanged for 40,000 years. They had no sense of ownership or land. They were congenitally incapable of settling down or living in a house. They were always going walkabout. Every evening I would go for long walks around Churachirai, trying to work out how I might get across to such people something of the understanding which Warlpiri people had imparted to me. I wanted whatever I wrote to be accessible to people such as Barry, who were mystified rather than malicious in their attitudes to Aboriginals. But what did I have to say? I'm going to leave it there, and perhaps there's questions which we can handle together in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Ask your question, Alison, about being embarrassed. The most embarrassing writing moment.
Okay, I'll lead off with the question that my other editors didn't want me to ask. I would be curious about your most embarrassing or surprising in a bad way publishing experience.
Just a couple very briefly. I remember doing a book with the Cambridge University Press called Religion and Political Culture in Britain and Ireland, and I waited very patiently for this book to come, and it arrived, I think, about the 23rd of December before CUP shut down for a 2-week vacation, which is what happens in the British Isles. And I looked, I sort of trembled, looked at this, first time you see it. And then I realized that they'd left out the acknowledgement page and then the contents page. And I thought, wow. And then I kept flicking over and found out that every other page was completely blank on the book. And I thought, And that kind of feeling of, did they print 2,000 copies of it? And of course I couldn't get through to them because they'd all gone for their vacations. I had to wait until, I think it was January the 5th or something to contact them. And they had sent me the only really bad copy, but it was just for 2 weeks. I was just looking at these blank sheets. That was a pretty bad experience.
Alison asked me that, and I instantly thought back to when I was the features editor of my high school newspaper, and John Lennon was murdered, and I very carefully made this beautiful little box that said, "In Memoriam, John Lennon, U.M., Memoriam without an A." And they printed it, and my teacher made everybody sit there and change all those U's to an A as I suffered. But I also told Alison, I think I'm about to have my most embarrassing publishing moment, because I have an essay that I gave as a lecture at a conference in Ireland, actually, years and years ago, that's about to come out, and it's been so long since I've looked at it, and I think I've probably changed my mind about various things. That's just one of the horrors of publishing that just keeps happening to you over and over again, because you will change your mind. And I have occasionally embarrassed actual people in my life by what I've written, because I've written some about my family, and that's a whole interesting question too about how we write about people in our lives, and what's our story to tell and what's not our story to tell. So figuring that out is an ongoing question.
My moment's more ironic and disappointing than embarrassing. Duke University sold the Australian rights to HarperCollins, who published an Australian edition of this book for distribution in Australia, which, as I said, was where I wanted the book to kind of wind up. HarperCollins was then bought by one of the three kind of great publishing giants, I don't know which one, which kind of ate it up. And all the HarperCollins books in print in the warehouses were trashed. And so not a single copy of my book went into circulation in Australia. So these are the things, as David was saying, that luck is also sort of often bad luck. You don't know what's going to kind of come out of left field and change the course of your publishing history.
In that pattern of certainly it happened quite often to me actually, of you start a book with an editor who leaves or a publishing house which is bought over, and suddenly all things change around you, and the person that is advocating for you is no longer there, and sometimes your book can just get buried in the so that those vicissitudes of the publishing industry, which for a time was going through tremendous, I don't know if it's settled down but this is pretty fast-moving trade actually, and very fast-moving editors who sometimes can be very dispiriting.
I'm wondering two related things. How do you figure out, especially as a younger person, how much to put yourself out there, especially if you know that you're still developing your ideas, or you might change your mind, like you said, change your mind 10 years from now and really regret, something may come back to haunt you. And also, how do you navigate telling semi-personal stories about others in your life, like you were alluding to?
Right.
More comments on that?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer to that second one, but the first question about, you'll inevitably change your mind and your thought will inevitably move forward. We read a novel by Charles Johnson called Middle Passage and Journey and Quest this year, and he learned to write from John Gardner. He apprenticed himself to John Gardner, who was a great writing teacher, and he wrote a lot of novels before he ever published one. And John Gardner, he wrote like 6 novels, and then somebody offered to publish one of them, and John Gardner said, if you think it's something you're going to have to step over later, don't do it. And he didn't, and then he wrote his great novels. But I think in academic writing, hopefully we're always moving forward in our thinking and changing our minds, and so I think we do the best that we can. I think just write as truthfully as you can in the moment that you're writing. These guys probably have more wisdom than that on that question. On the question of writing about people that you love and that are in your life, I grew up a preacher's and professor's kid, and so I was always being told, stories about me were constantly being told in public in a way that was both deeply embarrassing and deeply pleasurable at the same time. And I think when Michael, you should answer this question. When we write about the living, we have, and the dead, actually, we have a responsibility to tell their stories as well as we can, I think. And sometimes I've stopped myself when I have, if there's been any question whether it's my story to tell or not, I try not to tell it, unless I have had lots of conversation about it, I guess. But I don't know, as an anthropologist, you probably have probably thought about that a lot.
I think that, a lot of people say, you put so much work into your writing and you make it literary, and they want me to talk about this. But I think it's very important to say that one never writes in a literary way because that's what you want to do. You write in a way that, as it were, is going to communicate with the audience that you kind of want to target. And this all depends, and these risks, as you say, these innovations, these experimentations, these various ways we push the envelope, should all be determined by a commitment that you have, and everybody's got a different commitment. Some people's commitment is solely to their profession, and they will write within the bounds and conventions of the academy. other people like me have a commitment to the world outside the academy. And I want to kind of build bridges and cross the gap between the two to the extent that is possible for me. And that then drives the way you write. It drives the way you kind of frame everything you do. So everything kind of comes back to where your kind of commitments are, where your values are.
Yeah, in terms of how much to put yourself out there, and I certainly found it useful at the early part of my career just to rely on people who I respected to give me an honest opinion on whether something was premature or worth going with. And of course, inevitably, as you look back over your life, as the others have said, that there are pieces that you think are less good than others, and that's just the way it is. And I think that's part of the thick skin that's required. I think as a historian, I feel a duty at least always to have some kind of evidence-based work that I'm doing, that even if the interpretation turns out to be a little crazy over the years, that at least there is something solidly researched in it that might still be worth looking at. But that will vary, I think, with different disciplines. But I do think just the advice of people I respected was, and I think one does need older conversation partners who are willing to be pretty straight up with you.
It's very interesting. You're talking about being in Northern Ireland during the period of the Troubles. I mean, here's a question of risk, which David spoke to, I think, very, very powerfully. This constrains us. It's nothing to do with the academic constraints and conventions. It's the world in which we're living, which is constraining us, demanding things of us, or actually inhibiting certain kind of things that we might otherwise do. But this is very healthy, even though it's very hard.
Yeah.
So in my own experience, when I was doing research with a congregation, and I was doing historical research, I wasn't doing ethnographic research, I was working with the church archivist, and he was pretty clear with me that he would love to have my paper in their archive because it would be of value to them. And I think a lot of the things I was finding would have been of value to them. And by the time I was done writing it, I realized that the style of my writing would have come off to them as very critical, and I think they would have been offended by it. And so I guess kind of in terms of this question of commitments, at what point in your writing do you kind of decide what your commitments are? Because I think that if I had decided from the beginning that my commitment was to make it something that they could have in their archives, I kind of would have had to write a different paper. And so I'm just kind of wondering when you think it's the right time to make that decision.
Good question. I do think I think what I hear in the other presentations that are made is that there's a kind of I think there's a kind of fierce integrity in the best writing that really comes through. It's hard to fake, and it's hard to and I think at some deep level one does need to be true to oneself of what you believe to be the case, regardless of how it seems. I mean, a linked experience to that. I did my PhD thesis on Methodist anti-Catholicism in the 18th and 19th century, at a time when the Methodist Church and the Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church were in ecumenical dialogue. And this was not welcomed, actually. It was made clear to me it wasn't particularly welcomed. And for a time I did have some difficulty getting access to sources and so on. I think at moments like that, and of course they then doubted that this anti-Catholic tradition was there at all, that this is something I was finding for malevolent, well, not exactly malevolent, but I was exaggerating it or whatever. But I think at moments like that, it is hard. You second guess yourself sometimes and think, I might just make so there's a lot of kind of inner voices competing sometimes. But I think at the end, some kind of personal integrity has got to shine through. Otherwise, it's the kind of New Grub Street of Gissing's novel that we just write to serve as commodities for certain.
I was thinking about one thing Michael said when he stood up to give his talk, when he said writing and thinking are sort of the same thing. Is that what you said? Or part of the same thing. And I definitely feel that way. I don't know what I think until I'm writing. I think, my colleague Amy Hollywood, she can read, and then she can sit down over a week. She can kind of work it all out in her head, and then she can sit down, she can write it all out. And I have no idea what I'm thinking until I'm actually trying to find language for it. And so I think, if that's right, if writing and thinking are so deeply interconnected, and if it is of course possible to deploy rhetorical skill, all the rhetorical skill I know you all possess as writers, to bludgeon another or to, we can do things, we can not tell the truth. There's lots of things we can do as writers. But I think, if you're in that archive and you're thinking as you write, then you're committed. You're committed to your thought, to what you're finding, to the best that you can, the most accurate that you can be.
I'd just like to sort of add something. When I was in my early 20s, one of my great intellectual mentors was a Bengali historian, Brijen Gupta. He taught at the University of Rochester for many years, now retired. And he used to sort of get on my case all the time by saying, "Boy, you've got to get a point of view." Yeah. And I said, "Well, I've got a point of view." He said, "What is it?" I got the faintest idea. So at a certain age, but in retrospect, I can see it was there all along, but I hadn't yet, as it were, articulated it. And I think that in everything you write, everything you do, every book you read, every person you meet, in a sense, is helping the kind of helping this point of view get born.
That's right.
Until finally you can hold it in your hands. It's no longer in your belly and invisible to you.
That's right.
And you can say, "Oh, yes, so this is my point of view." And then, as David said, you've got to stick to that. That's who you are. Even though you might envy somebody else their point of view because it seems to be more attractive, or it's getting them more kind of has more cash value in the professional world, you've got to go with yours.
One more?
Absolutely.
Hi. I've been thinking a lot lately about why writing is important, beyond differently than why information is important, and I'm totally unable to articulate it for myself. So I'm asking you to do it. And I'm thinking about, a couple of days ago, Adrienne Rich read at Radcliffe, and I remembered that writing is important. And I've been reading Mahmoud Darwish and then Brian Turner's new book of poetry about Iraq, and so I remember that writing is important, different from information. It's important, but I don't know what else. What else?
Walter Benjamin talks about this in his wonderful essay, The Storyteller. He takes the view that, one of the tragedies of our time is that we don't tell stories anymore, or that stories have fallen in value. And where we told stories before, which are kind of accounts of our experience, they're accounts of what we have actually got firsthand an understanding of, has been replaced by knowledge or information, which in a sense circulates without a context, without a person or a personality. And he kind of makes this case for recovering storytelling, which is at the same time a way of recovering experience. And a lot of people, I think, experimenting with academic writing nowadays have tried to sort of get back to a narrative mode of writing, which retains a sense of the process of coming to an understanding and just doesn't kind of cut all that away and present the final sort of result detached from and abstracted from the context in which it was kind of produced. And I think this is one of the ways in which kind of a lot of academic writing in all disciplines is kind of remaking itself.
Yeah, I agree very much with that. I think that, again, and the kind of historical writing that one does, communicating information of some kind is obviously vital, but I think great works move beyond that substantially, really, to interpretive sophistication of various kinds of how this stuff is shaped, and whether you can write it with a narrative set of stories in it as well. I mean, a lot of historical writing went either toward the very theoretical direction or the very kind of meticulous research-based scholarship, but without much of a kind of shapening for one to. So I think these are always. I do think these are things that you never quite work out. It's always in negotiation with oneself, and I do think there is a need for not just other people to say what how your work is, but I think, in my experience, the older I have become, the more critical I am of my own work. There's a certain kind of, sense of excitement about seeing your name in print and at the early stages of one's career. And I think as time goes on, I get ever more nervous about what I've written or the way I think, but without trying not to allow it to make me too timid. But these are all kind of things that are quite difficult to work out and be precise about, I think.
Yeah, I don't think this answers your question, but one, I was thinking about a colleague, when I first finished my PhD, and I was sort of thinking about what my first project would be and all of that, and I was trying to figure out what kind of scholar I wanted to be, and I was looking around for teachers and models. I had a friend who still teaches at the Colorado College in Colorado Springs. She's a great medievalist, and she's done a lot of, she's written a lot of really important essays, and she's done a lot of really great translations and things that you absolutely have to have in the field, just stuff you have to have. Now, one of the things that makes writing hard in academic life is that it's the currency that we trade for jobs and for promotions and for stuff. And the book is the currency of the day, as anyone going up for tenure will tell you. But when my friend had never written the big monograph, the big book about everything, and when I said to her, when are you going to write, this monograph? And she said, I really like to do the small, beautiful thing, and I've never forgotten that, because that's her. I mean, she does do the small, beautiful thing, and it's not small and unimportant. It's hugely important, and every idea just pursued down to the ground, and everything expressed as truthfully as possible, and just loving attention to the archive and what's there in the archive, and I think while you're in school, this is a fantastic time to learn to do the small, beautiful thing, to work with the 25-page essay, which is kind of what it is when you send something into an academic journal. That that's the range, and to really let yourself get good at that form, and learn to do the small, beautiful thing, and then I think the larger things maybe will come more easily. But that's a great thing to be working on while you're in school, I think, because you'll need to publish your dissertation, you'll need to get your second book going, and you'll need all of that you'll need to do. That's the reality of the thing. But the small, beautiful thing is also a really, really important part of this work.
I think from that point of view, it is worth trying to just press your beleaguered professors for real, serious comment on those works, really, not just a kind of perfunctory grade or whatever, because I think that kind of feedback is tremendously important at this stage. I certainly, at that stage, very much valued some people willing to go the extra mile with red pens and with careful criticism, which is sometimes hard. I think for all of us, that kind of criticism is sometimes hard to take. But,
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have to point out two things in closing. One, culture is not online, so you can publish in it and not have to step over it later.
There you go.
It only lasts as long as the book does, and it's hard to find if you don't know where to look. The second thing I want to point out is that Emily Roos arrived late. She's from JP and a friend of mine from college, but she's designed all three of the journals, and they get more gorgeous every year. So meet her at the reception. And yeah, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And join us in the Braun Room for food and drinks and to pick up your copy.